The folded letter slid across my dining table like a snake. My daughter-in-law's manicured finger rested on its edge, her smile as cold as winter morning frost. "Mother, I think it's time you considered other arrangements." The words floated around me, soft as feathers. But feathers can suffocate you if there's enough of them. My eyes caught the black ink stamped across the paper, words that would haunt me for weeks. Transfer of occupancy. Owner in question. Occupant unauthorized. In one breath, I became a ghost in my own home. The kitchen where I'd stirred soup for 40 years suddenly felt foreign. The walls I'd painted with my late husband's steady hands seemed to close in. The floors we'd chosen tile by tile now felt like quicksand beneath my feet. She didn't scream, didn't slam doors or throw dishes. That would have been honest. Instead, she used paperwork like a surgical knife, cutting me out with precision that left no visible wounds. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. My son sat across from us, his silence heavy as lead. Not once did he meet my eyes. Not once did he say, "Wait, this is my mother's house." His quiet felt like betrayal served on fine china. The dining room we'd built together, my husband and I, watched this scene unfold. The chandelier he'd hung crooked 3 times before getting it right cast shadows that seemed to judge us all. The table where we'd celebrated birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Tuesday dinners now hosted my funeral. "There are lovely facilities," she continued, her voice honey-sweet with poison underneath. "Places where you'd be more comfortable." Comfortable. The word tasted like ashes. I'd been comfortable here for decades. Comfortable in the bedroom where my husband whispered his last, "I love you." Comfortable in the garden where his roses still bloomed. Comfortable in the basement workshop where his tools waited for hands that would never return. She slid another paper across the table. A brochure for Sunset Manor. Happy old people smiled from its pages, playing cards and painting pottery. They looked content in their contained little world, separated from real life like exhibits in a museum. "You deserve care," she said. "Professional care." But I heard what she really meant. You deserve to disappear. The worst part? She wasn't wrong about the paperwork. I'd never looked at the legal stuff. My husband handled all that boring business while I handled everything else. Now that trust felt like foolishness. My hands shook as I picked up the documents. The words blurred together, but their meaning crashed over me like ice water. According to these papers, I had no legal right to stay. According to these papers, the house belonged to my son. According to these papers, she could make me leave whenever she wanted. The room spun slightly. 43 years of marriage, 35 years in this house, and decades of believing I was building something permanent. All of it reduced to legal jargon that said I was nobody. She gathered the papers with efficient movements, like a businesswoman closing a deal. "We'll give you time to process this," she said. "But not too much time." That night, I sat in my bedroom, was it still my bedroom? Staring at the ceiling. The house creaked around me, settling into darkness. Every sound felt different now. Instead of comfort, I heard countdown. My son's footsteps passed by my door without stopping. No goodnight. No explanation. No apology. I'd raised that boy from scraped knees to graduation day. I'd cheered at his baseball games and cried at his wedding. I'd welcomed his wife into our family like the daughter I'd never had. And now he sat downstairs with her, probably planning my exit strategy while I stared at shadows. But as I lay there in the dark, something my husband used to say echoed in my mind. He'd always been careful about important things. Paranoid, even. "Annie," he'd whisper during late-night talks about the future, "I've made sure you'll always be protected." I'd assumed he meant life insurance. maybe some savings. But what if he meant something else? What if, somewhere in this house, there were answers she didn't know about? What she didn't know was that the house she was so eager to take from me was never hers to begin with. The laughter cut through my ceiling like broken glass. 3 days after that dinner table ambush, I sat upstairs in what used to feel like my sanctuary, listening to them celebrate below. Their voices drifted up through the heating vents, warm, comfortable, planning a future that didn't include me. We could turn her room into an office, my daughter-in-law said between giggles. Or maybe a nursery someday. My room. The bedroom where I'd held my husband's hand as cancer stole his breath. The space where I'd cried myself empty after his funeral, then slowly learned to breathe again. She was already redecorating it in her mind, erasing me before I'd even packed a single box. I pressed my ear to the floor, hating myself for eavesdropping in my own home. But I needed to know. I needed to understand how completely they'd written me out of their story. "Mom will be happier at Sunset Manor," my son said. His voice carried no conviction. "She'll make friends." Friends. As if I could replace 40 years of shared memories with card games and craft time. As if the woman who'd taught him to ride a bike and bandaged his scraped knees could be swapped out for recreational therapists and scheduled activities. The house felt different now. Every corner held whispers of conversations I wasn't invited to join. Every meal became a negotiation of space and silence. They ate together while I picked at leftovers, invisible at my own kitchen table. My bedroom became my prison. I'd retreat there after dinner, listening to their lives continue without me. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of their planning sessions through the crack under my door. Legal documents spread across the coffee table, highlighted sections that probably outlined my eviction timeline. The walls seemed to shrink each day. Pictures of family gatherings mocked me from their frames. My late husband smiled from the dresser, frozen in happier times when this house rang with love instead of cold calculation. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake remembering when this place bustled with life. Birthday parties where kids tracked mud through the living room. Holiday dinners when the table groaned under the weight of too much food and laughter. Sunday mornings when my husband read the paper aloud while I cooked breakfast, the rhythm of our routine as comfortable as breathing. Now the silence upstairs felt like suffocation while life hummed along below me, planning my replacement. One morning, I found evidence of their future without me. A real estate brochure tucked between couch cushions, featuring luxury condos across town. They weren't just planning to get rid of me, they were planning to cash out on the house I'd poured my soul into. The betrayal tasted metallic, like blood from biting my tongue too hard. I started avoiding them altogether. I'd wait until they left for work, then move through the house like a ghost, touching surfaces that remembered better days. The kitchen counter where I'd rolled thousands of cookies. The living room where we'd watched my son take his first steps. The front porch where my husband proposed on a spring evening that felt like forever ago. Every memory now came with an expiration date. The worst part wasn't their planning. It was their assumption that I'd go quietly. That I'd pack my life into cardboard boxes and disappear without a fight. That I'd trade 4 decades of belonging for 3 meals a day and supervised activities. They underestimated the woman who'd raised their children and buried their father. They forgot that quiet doesn't always mean weak. But lying there in the dark, listening to them laugh at my expense, something shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, raw as an open wound. But underneath it, anger began to simmer. Not the explosive kind that breaks dishes and slams doors. The slow-burning kind that plans and waits and remembers everything. My husband's voice whispered through the darkness, words he'd said during those last difficult months when his body was failing but his mind stayed sharp. "Annie, I've taken care of everything. Don't let anyone tell you different." I'd thought he meant funeral arrangements. Insurance papers. The boring business of death. But what if he meant something else? What if somewhere in this house, hidden in places she'd never think to look, were answers that could change everything? And then, in the quiet of the attic, I found something they never expected me to find. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if someone tried to erase you from your own home? The cedar trunk sat in the corner like a forgotten prayer. I'd climbed those attic stairs 100 times over the years, storing Christmas decorations and outgrown clothes, but I'd never really looked at that old chest. It belonged to my husband's mother, passed down through generations of women who'd learned to hide important things in plain sight. The hinges creaked like old bones as I lifted the lid. Moth-eaten quilts released the scent of lavender and thyme. Beneath layers of family photographs and baby clothes, my fingers found something that made my heart skip, a manila envelope, thick with papers and sealed with my husband's careful handwriting. For Annie. When you need to remember who you are. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside, documents I'd never seen before. Not sentimental letters or love notes, but legal papers that would rewrite everything my daughter-in-law thought she knew about power. The handwriting was unmistakably his, firm, slanted, methodical as everything he did. Bank statements showing accounts I'd forgotten existed. Insurance policies with my name as sole beneficiary. And at the bottom of the stack, a deed that stopped my breath cold. The house wasn't in my son's name. It never had been. My husband had created something called a living trust, a web of legal protection I'd never understood when he tried to explain it years ago. Back then, I'd nodded and smiled, trusting him to handle the boring paperwork while I managed everything else. Now I saw the genius of his careful planning. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every home insurance policy for the last 20 years, all of it traced back to a trust that made me the permanent, untouchable owner of this house. My son had been listed as a beneficiary, not an inheritor. There was a massive legal difference that my daughter-in-law had either missed or ignored. The papers rustled in my shaking hands. Deeds. Contracts. Notarized documents with official seals that looked more powerful than anything she'd shown me at that dinner table. My husband hadn't just loved me, he'd protected me with the kind of foresight that reaches beyond death. I spread the documents across the dusty attic floor like treasure maps. Each one told the same story. This house belonged to me, completely and legally, no matter what manipulative paperwork my daughter-in-law waved around. But knowing the truth and proving it were different battles entirely. The trust documents were complex, written in legal language that twisted my brain into knots. Terms like irrevocable beneficiary and grantor provisions might as well have been ancient Greek. I understood the heart of it, the house was mine, but I'd need help translating the technical details into courtroom language. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands steadier now than they'd been in weeks. Evidence. Proof. Ammunition for a fight I was finally ready to wage. The attic felt different as I carefully returned everything to the envelope. No longer a storage space for forgotten things, but a vault that held my salvation. My husband's voice seemed to whisper through the rafters, reminding me that love doesn't end with death. Sometimes it transforms into protection that spans years. Downstairs, I could hear my daughter-in-law on the phone, probably with her lawyer friends, discussing my situation like I was a problem to be solved. Her confident voice drifted up through the vents, full of assumptions about a battle she thought she'd already won. If only she knew what I'd just discovered. If only she realized that the woman she dismissed as too old and too weak to fight had just found weapons she never knew existed. I tucked the envelope into my bedroom closet, hidden behind winter coats that smelled like mothballs and memories. That night, I slept with my back straighter than it had been in months, dreaming of my husband's careful hands organizing these papers, planning for a day he'd hoped would never come. The next morning, I watched my daughter-in-law sip coffee in my kitchen, reading real estate listings on her tablet. She looked so sure of herself, so certain that her paperwork trumped everything else. She had no idea that upstairs, tucked behind wool coats and old scarves, lay documents that would shatter her carefully constructed lie. But papers alone are only words. I needed someone who knew how to turn them into power. If you're still watching, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what happens next. The church bulletin board held my miracle on a yellow sticky note. Legal aid services, free consultations. Ask for Clarice Benton. I'd never paid attention to those community announcements before, but desperation makes you notice things you'd normally overlook. After Sunday service, when Mrs. Henderson mentioned her troubles at home to a circle of concerned women, someone touched her arm and whispered, "Go see Clarice. She fights with paper, not fists." That phrase stuck in my mind like a splinter. Fighting with paper. Exactly what I needed. The legal aid office sat in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service, the kind of place you'd drive past without thinking twice. No marble floors or golden nameplates, just worn carpet and fluorescent lights that hummed like tired insects. But sometimes salvation comes in humble packages. Clarice Benton looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her desk was organized chaos, stacks of folders, coffee-stained legal pads, and a computer that looked older than my microwave. "Tell me what's happening," she said, gesturing to the plastic chair across from her desk. "No small talk, no judgments about my age or situation. Just business." I placed the manila envelope on her desk like an offering. "My daughter-in-law wants me gone. Says the house belongs to my son. But I found these." Her expression didn't change as she examined each document, but I noticed her lips press into a thin line. She spread the papers across her desk with the precision of someone who'd seen similar battles before. "Your husband was smart," she finally said, looking up at me with something that might have been respect. "This trust makes you untouchable, if we follow the trail correctly." Untouchable. I hadn't felt that word in months. It wrapped around me like armor I'd forgotten I owned. She explained the legal framework in language I could understand. The living trust created an unbreakable chain of ownership that protected the house from exactly the kind of challenge my daughter-in-law was mounting. Every document in that envelope was another link in that chain, proof that this battle had been won years ago by a man who'd loved me enough to see around corners. "The question is," Clarice continued, "do you want to fight or do you want to disappear quietly?" The old me might have chosen peace over confrontation. The woman who'd spent 3 days listening to them laugh about my replacement might have packed her bags and found a nice apartment somewhere. But the woman sitting in that plastic chair, armed with her husband's foresight and a lawyer who understood the power of paper, felt different. Stronger. Ready. "I want to fight." Clarice smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Good. Because your daughter-in-law has made a classic mistake. She assumed you were powerless because you were quiet. She's about to learn the difference." We spent the next hour mapping strategy. Every document needed to be authenticated. Every claim in my daughter-in-law's paperwork needed to be challenged. Every assumption about my legal status needed to be corrected with the kind of precision that left no room for argument. "This won't be quick," Clarice warned. "Legal battles move like honey in winter. But we have something she doesn't: the truth, properly documented." I felt lighter walking out of that office than I had in weeks. Not because the fight was over, but because I finally had someone who saw the battle the same way I did. Not as an old woman being shuffled aside, but as a property owner defending what was rightfully hers. The drive home felt different. The houses in my neighborhood looked familiar again instead of foreign. My own driveway welcomed me like an old friend. The key turned in the lock of my door. Not their door, not my son's door, but mine. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table where this whole nightmare had started, But instead of feeling defeated, I felt strategic. Let them laugh in the living room. Let them plan my exit. They had no idea what was coming. My daughter-in-law walked through the kitchen around 9, probably heading to get a snack. She glanced at me sitting there with my tea and gave me that pitying smile I'd grown to hate. "How are you feeling tonight, Mother?" "Better," I said. And meant it. She paused, maybe hearing something different in my voice, but shrugged and continued to the refrigerator. Let her dismiss the change. Let her think I was just having a good day. Soon enough, she'd understand that quiet doesn't mean defeated. It just means I was getting ready to fight back with weapons she never saw coming. For the first time in months, I slept with my back straight because I knew I wasn't fighting alone anymore. Sometimes the right people appear at the right time. Share this story with someone who needs hope. The dining room table had never seen so many papers. Clarice and I turned my house into a war room, spreading decades of documentation across the same surface where my daughter-in-law had tried to serve me my eviction notice. The irony tasted sweet as morning coffee. Every receipt told a story. Every contract revealed another crack in her carefully constructed lie. We worked through coffee-stained afternoons, building a fortress of evidence that would be impossible to ignore. "Look at this," Clarice said, holding up a home insurance policy from 15 years ago. "Your name, your signature, your premium payments. If your son owned this house, why would you be paying to insure it?" The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and obvious. We found the same pattern everywhere: utility bills, property taxes, maintenance contracts. All bearing my name, all pointing to the same undeniable truth. I wasn't a guest in this house. I was the owner, and the paper trail proved it beyond argument. My daughter-in-law's timing couldn't have been worse for her case. She'd launched her attack just as we were gathering ammunition she didn't know existed. Every day brought new discoveries that strengthened our position. The repair receipts were particularly damaging to her claims. When the roof needed fixing 3 years ago, who'd signed the contract? Me. When the furnace died last winter, whose name was on the replacement order? Mine. When the kitchen faucet leaked for weeks, who'd called the plumber and paid the bill? Not my son. Not his wife. Me. She made a classic legal mistake, Clarice explained while organizing documents into neat piles. She assumed possession equals ownership. But property law doesn't work that way. Paper beats assumptions every time. We discovered that my son had never actually inherited the house, despite what his wife claimed. The trust documents showed he was listed as a contingent beneficiary, meaning he'd only inherit if something happened to me. And since I was very much alive and legally competent, her entire case collapsed like a house of cards in a strong wind. The most damaging evidence came from her own paperwork. Remember those official-looking documents she'd slid across the dinner table? Clarice studied them with the enthusiasm of a detective finding the killer's fingerprints. "These are impressive-looking," she admitted, "but they're essentially meaningless. Transfer of occupancy forms without proper ownership documentation. She's trying to evict you from property you legally own. It's like trying to sell someone else's car." Every day made me stronger. Not just legally, but personally. Each document we authenticated was another reminder of the life I'd built here, the responsibilities I'd shouldered, the home I'd maintained through decades of ordinary devotion. The evidence painted a picture of a woman who'd never stopped being the primary caretaker of this property. While my son lived here as an adult child, and while his wife enjoyed the benefits of a home she hadn't paid for, I'd been the one ensuring the lights stayed on and the mortgage got paid. "Your daughter-in-law thought she could overwhelm you with paperwork," Clarice said during one of our afternoon sessions. "But she underestimated 2 things, your husband's planning and your own determination." The trust documents were masterpieces of protective legal language. My husband had anticipated challenges to ownership and built safeguards into every clause. Even if someone tried to claim the house through inheritance laws, the trust structure made such challenges virtually impossible. We found bank records showing continuous mortgage payments from accounts in my name. Tax assessments listing me as the responsible party. Even voter registration records showing this as my primary residence for over 30 years. Every scrap of paper told the same story. This house belonged to me, completely and legally. My daughter-in-law's confidence started cracking around the edges. She'd catch me on the phone with Clarice and try to eavesdrop, but I'd simply smile and continue my conversation. Let her wonder. Let her worry. For months, she'd held all the power. Now the scales were tipping. One evening, she cornered me in the kitchen. "Mother, we need to discuss your situation. The lawyers are getting impatient." "Which lawyers?" I asked innocently. She named a firm downtown, expensive-sounding attorneys who probably charged more per hour than most people made in a day. Good. Let her waste money on legal fees while Clarice and I built an unassailable case with free legal aid and the truth. "They're saying we could force the issue," she continued. "Court orders, that sort of thing." "That sounds complicated," I replied, refilling my tea. "I hope you're prepared for complications." Something in my tone made her pause. For the first time since this whole mess started, she looked at me like I might not be as helpless as she'd assumed. My daughter-in-law thought I was too old to fight. She was about to learn I wasn't fighting alone. If you've ever been underestimated, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning like thunder in a clear sky. My daughter-in-law stood at the kitchen counter, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips, staring at the official envelope in her hands. The return address bore the seal of the county courthouse, and I watched her confidence crumble in real time. She'd been expecting victory mail, maybe confirmation of her transfer requests or court dates that would formalize my removal. Instead, Clarice had delivered something that made her hands shake. Motion to freeze transfer of property ownership. Granted. The words hung in the morning air like church bells announcing Judgment Day. Every attempt to remove my name from this house had been stopped cold by a judge who didn't even need to hear our full story. The paperwork spoke for itself. I sipped my tea and watched her read the document 3 times, as if repetition might change the words on the page. Her weapon had been paperwork. Mine was too, except mine was backed by decades of truth she'd never bothered to investigate. "What is this?" she finally asked, waving the letter like it had personally insulted her. "Legal proceedings," I replied calmly. "Something about property ownership disputes." She knew. The careful blankness in her expression told me she understood exactly what this meant. No more confident declarations about my departure timeline. No more treating me like a squatter in my own home. The freeze order had stopped her legal assault dead in its tracks. My son appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tension crackling between us. "What's wrong?" She handed him the letter without a word. I watched his face change as he read, seeing perhaps for the first time that his mother wasn't as helpless as they'd assumed. "I don't understand," he said, which was probably the most honest thing he'd said in months. "Someone's challenging our ownership claim," his wife replied through gritted teeth. "Someone with a lawyer." They both looked at me then, really looked, maybe wondering when the quiet old woman at the kitchen table had learned to fight back. I just smiled and refilled my teacup. Let them wonder. Let them worry. The freeze order was more than legal protection. It was psychological warfare. Every morning, my daughter-in-law had to wake up knowing her carefully planned takeover had hit a wall she couldn't climb over or go around. She tried maintaining normalcy, but cracks showed everywhere. Sharp comments about ungrateful people and family loyalty. Whispered phone calls that stopped when I entered rooms. Frustrated sighs when she thought no one was listening. The house itself seemed to breathe easier. Without the constant threat of eviction hanging over everything, I could walk through rooms that felt like home again instead of temporary shelter. But the real satisfaction came from watching her realize that the woman she'd dismissed as too old and too weak to fight had just demonstrated the difference between being quiet and being defeated. That evening, she cornered me in the hallway outside my bedroom. "Mother, we need to talk about this misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. As if 40 years of property ownership was some kind of clerical error. What misunderstanding? I asked innocently. Her jaw tightened. This legal challenge. It's unnecessary. We're family. Family doesn't usually serve eviction notices over dinner. The words hung between us like a bridge burning. She'd spent months treating this like a business transaction, and now she wanted to play the family card when her business approach had failed. "We can work this out," she continued, her voice taking on that honey-sweet tone I'd learned to distrust. "Without lawyers. Without complications." But I'd already learned the value of complications. Sometimes complications are just justice taking its time to arrive. The freeze order had given us breathing room to build our case, and Clarice was using every day to strengthen our position. More documents. More proof. More evidence that my daughter-in-law's entire legal strategy was built on assumptions that crumbled under scrutiny. But this was only the first shot fired. The war was still coming. Comment below. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when no one else would? The house became a battlefield where every conversation was a landmine. 3 weeks after the freeze order arrived, tension crackled through every room like static electricity before a storm. My daughter-in-law had abandoned her honey-sweet pretense, replacing it with the kind of cold politeness that cuts deeper than outright hostility. Meals became exercises in careful navigation. She'd serve dinner with movements so precise they looked choreographed, setting my plate down just a little too firmly, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Pass the salt, please, mother," she'd say, loading the word mother with enough sarcasm to poison the entire meal. My son sat between us like a referee at a boxing match, flinching every time one of us spoke. The man who'd once filled this house with laughter now moved through it like he was walking through a minefield. But the real war happened in whispers and half-heard conversations. Late at night, when they thought I was asleep, I'd catch fragments of their strategy sessions through the heating vents. Her voice, sharp with frustration. "She can't keep this up forever. Old people get tired." His response, weaker, "Maybe we should just wait." Wait for what? For her to die? That could be years. The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just trying to remove me from the house. She was literally waiting for me to die so she could claim what she thought was hers. But if she thought age would make me surrender, she'd miscalculated badly. Every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every whispered conversation about my mortality only strengthened my resolve to fight. The psychological pressure was relentless. She'd leave real estate brochures on the coffee table, highlighted sections advertising senior living communities, with photos of smiling elderly people engaged in supervised activities. The message was clear: this is where you belong, not here. She'd comment on my forgetfulness in front of my son, making gentle observations about missed appointments I'd never made or conversations I couldn't remember having. Planting seeds of doubt about my mental competency, preparing ground for a different kind of legal challenge. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest weapon. Friends stopped calling as often, maybe sensing the tension when they phoned. Family gatherings became awkward affairs where everyone walked on eggshells, afraid of saying something that might inflame the situation further. But she made one critical mistake. She underestimated how visible her cruelty had become. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chun, mentioned it during a casual conversation over the fence. "Everything all right over there, Annie?" Seems like there's been some tension. Word was spreading. People were noticing. And in a neighborhood where everyone had known me for decades, my daughter-in-law's campaign to erase me was starting to look like exactly what it was: a calculated attack on an elderly woman by someone young enough to wait for inheritance. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when I overheard her on the phone with someone, probably one of those expensive lawyers she'd hired. "She's becoming a problem," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Stubborn old woman won't listen to reason. We need to explore other options." Other options. The phrase sent ice through my veins. "Competency hearings?" she continued. "Mental health evaluations? Something that proves she's not capable of making these decisions anymore." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, understanding finally that this wasn't just about the house anymore. She was preparing to attack my mind, my independence, my very identity as a functioning adult. But what she didn't know was that every conversation, every cruel comment, every whispered strategy session was being carefully documented. Clarice had taught me to keep records, and I'd become meticulous about noting dates, times, and witnesses to her behavior. The woman who'd once told me I didn't belong in my own home was about to discover that cruelty leaves evidence, and evidence has a way of coming back to haunt you in courtrooms. But I had one more surprise for her, one she could never see coming. If this story has you hooked, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the ending. The conference room smelled like fear and expensive perfume. Clarice had arranged the meeting at her office, neutral ground where legal battles get fought with documents instead of whispered threats. My daughter-in-law arrived dressed for war: sharp gray suit, briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and a lawyer who looked like he charged by the syllable. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one my husband had always said brought out my eyes. If this was going to be my final performance, I'd dress for the occasion. The table between us looked like a paper battlefield. Clarice had arranged our evidence with military precision: deed documents, trust papers, bank records, insurance policies, all organized in neat stacks that told the story of 4 decades of legal ownership. My daughter-in-law's lawyer, a thin man with silver hair and predatory eyes, spread his own documents across the table like he was playing poker with someone else's money. But I could see uncertainty creeping into his expensive confidence as Clarice began her presentation. "Let's start with the basics," Clarice said, her voice calm as Sunday morning church service. "Mrs. Anderson owns this house through a legally established living trust created by her late husband in 2003. This document supersedes any inheritance claims." She slid the trust paperwork across the table. Official seals, notarized signatures, legal language that made ownership absolutely clear. 20 years of protective planning by a man who'd loved me enough to see around corners. The opposing lawyer studied the documents, and I watched his confidence deflate like a punctured balloon. "These appear to be comprehensive," he admitted. "They are," Clarice replied. "But let's continue with the supporting evidence." What followed was a masterclass in legal demolition. Every claim my daughter-in-law had made, systematically destroyed with paper trails that reached back decades. Every assumption about ownership, corrected with official documentation that left no room for argument. Property tax records showing my name as the responsible party since 1985. Home insurance policies listing me as the sole policyholder. Utility bills, maintenance contracts, mortgage payments, all bearing my signature, all pointing to the same inescapable conclusion. "Your client," Clarice said, addressing the silver-haired lawyer directly, "has been attempting to evict the legal owner of this property from her own home." The words hung in the air like incense, sacred and undeniable. My daughter-in-law sat frozen, her perfect composure finally cracking. She'd spent months treating me like a squatter, and now a roomful of legal professionals was confirming what I'd known all along. This house belonged to me completely and legally. Her lawyer shuffled through his paperwork, looking for arguments that weren't there. The inheritance implications, he began weakly. There are no inheritance implications, Clarice interrupted. Mrs. Anderson is alive, legally competent, and the documented owner of the property in question. Her son has no legal claim while she lives, and even after her death, the trust structure determines inheritance, not state law. I didn't speak much during the meeting. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than any words I could have offered. 40 years of quiet responsibility, of paying bills and maintaining property and building a life in a place I'd never doubted belonged to me. But I did watch my daughter-in-law's face as each piece of evidence landed like a physical blow. The woman who'd slid eviction papers across my dinner table now couldn't meet my eyes. Her expensive lawyer tried one last desperate maneuver. We could explore competency questions. Based on what evidence? Clarice's voice could have frozen water. Mrs. Anderson has been managing this property independently for decades. She's organized, coherent, and fully capable of making legal decisions. Any attempt to question her competency would be frivolous and possibly sanctionable. The meeting lasted 2 hours, but the outcome was decided in the first 20 minutes. By the time Clarice finished presenting our case, the opposing lawyer was already organizing his retreat. We'll need time to review these documents, he said, which everyone in the room understood as lawyer speak for we're looking for the exit. My daughter-in-law finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd heard in months. This is still a family matter. No, I said quietly, breaking my silence. Family matters don't involve eviction notices. This is a legal matter, and legally, you have no claim to my house. By the time she finished, the woman who once told me I didn't belong in my home couldn't even look me in the eye. If you're rooting for this quiet justice, drop a "justice wins" in the comments. The phone call came 3 days later, surrender disguised as negotiation. Her lawyer's voice carried defeat like a flag of truce. Mrs. Anderson, we'd like to discuss resolution options that work for everyone involved. Resolution. The word tasted like victory served cold. Clarice handled the conversation with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. No theatrical demands, no dramatic ultimatums. Just clean, professional language that made withdrawal the only sensible option. Within a week, the official papers arrived. Formal withdrawal of all ownership claims. Acknowledgement of my legal rights to the property. Legal language that translated to simple English. They quit. My daughter-in-law signed the documents without ceremony, her signature smaller than usual, as if she were trying to disappear even from legal paperwork. The woman who'd once commanded my dining room like a general now moved through the house like a ghost preparing for her own funeral. The packing began immediately. Designer suitcases appeared in the hallway. Moving boxes materialized in corners like cardboard mushrooms after rain. The sound of tape guns echoed through rooms that had witnessed her confident declarations just months before. My son helped her pack in silence, his movements mechanical and ashamed. The man who'd sat quietly while his wife served me eviction papers now couldn't meet my eyes during their retreat. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't need theatrical confessions or tearful acknowledgments of wrongdoing. Their defeat was apology enough. But I did watch from my kitchen window as they loaded boxes into a moving truck, the same window where I'd watched my son take his first steps 35 years ago. Time moved in circles sometimes, bringing you back to places you'd never thought you'd see again. The house felt different as their belongings disappeared. Lighter somehow, like a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying was finally lifting. Rooms that had echoed with whispered conspiracies now breathed with the kind of peace that comes after storms pass. My daughter-in-law made one final attempt at conversation on her last day. She found me in the kitchen, the same spot where this whole nightmare had begun. "Mother," she said, her voice careful as someone walking on ice. I hope you understand this wasn't personal. I looked at her then, really looked, seeing maybe for the first time not a villain, but a woman who'd made terrible choices based on assumptions that proved wrong. It felt personal, I replied. She nodded, unable to argue with that truth. We'll be staying at the Marriott until we find something permanent. The Marriott. Hotel living while they searched for a home they could actually afford without my house as collateral. The luxury condos she'd browsed while planning my eviction had probably disappeared along with her access to my property value. They left on a Sunday morning, driving away in her silver sedan with the moving truck following behind like a funeral procession. My son waved from the passenger seat, a gesture that might have been goodbye or apology or simply acknowledgement of the grandmother-sized hole they were leaving in their lives. I stood in my doorway and watched them disappear around the corner, these people who'd shared my home but never understood that home isn't something you can take from someone. It's something you build together or not at all. The house settled around me like an old friend getting comfortable. No more whispered conversations about my departure. No more real estate brochures highlighting senior living facilities. No more feeling like a stranger in rooms I'd painted and floors I'd chosen and memories I'd built one ordinary day at a time. That evening, I called Clarice to thank her, but she brushed off my gratitude like dust from her shoulders. You did the hard part, she said. You stood up. I just helped translate your courage into legal language. But sitting in my kitchen that night, drinking tea from the cup my husband had given me 20 years ago, I understood that justice isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about refusing to be erased. Sometimes it's about standing your ground when everyone expects you to disappear quietly. There is a peculiar power in watching those who try to erase you retreat with nothing. Quiet justice doesn't need applause. It only needs truth. Don't forget to like and share this story if you believe in standing your ground. The morning light streams through my kitchen window like a benediction. 6 months have passed since they loaded that moving truck and drove away from the house they thought belonged to them. 6 months of silence that feels like peace instead of loneliness, of space that breathes with possibility instead of threat. I sit at the same table where my daughter-in-law once slid eviction papers across polished wood, but now it holds coffee and toast and the morning newspaper instead of legal weapons designed to make me disappear. The irony tastes sweeter than the jam I spread on homemade bread. The house has remembered how to be a home again. No more whispered conspiracies in corners. No more real estate brochures left like poison pills on coffee tables. No more feeling like a trespasser in rooms where my heartbeat had been keeping time for 40 years. My son calls sometimes, awkward conversations that dance around apologies he can't quite voice. I listen to his stilted updates about hotel living and apartment hunting, hearing in his voice the recognition of what he lost when he chose silence over standing up for his mother. We found a place, he told me last week. 2-bedroom apartment across town. It's nice. Nice. Such a small word for such a massive downgrade from the house they'd planned to inherit by erasing me from its history. But I don't take satisfaction in their reduced circumstances. That's not what justice looks like in the end. Justice looks like being able to walk through your own front door without wondering if you'll be allowed to stay. Justice sounds like silence that holds peace instead of plotting. The neighbors have been kinder since word spread about what happened. Mrs. Chun brings soup when she makes extra. The mailman asks about my roses. People who'd known me for decades but had started treating me like I was already gone now see me again as a person worth protecting. Clarice stops by occasionally, usually with legal updates that confirm what we already knew. The case is closed, the papers are filed, the house belongs to me as completely as breathing belongs to lungs. You did something important, she told me during her last visit. You showed that quiet doesn't mean powerless. But sitting here in the morning light, I understand that the most important victory wasn't legal. It was personal. It was refusing to disappear when disappearing would have been easier. It was choosing to fight for my place in a world that had already written me off as yesterday's news. The walls around me hold more than 40 years of memories now. They hold proof that love can reach beyond death to protect what matters. My husband's careful planning didn't just save the house, it saved the woman who lived in it. Sometimes I touch the wood trim on the staircase, the banister we sanded together when our backs were stronger and our futures seemed endless. The lemon polish still clings faintly to the wood, but now it smells like victory instead of memorial. The garden blooms according to seasons my husband planted before he knew he wouldn't see them all. His roses climb the trellis he built with hands that knew how to make things last. Even in death, his love keeps growing in soil we chose together. If someone were to ask me what I learned from those months of feeling erased from my own life, I'd tell them this: never assume silence means surrender. Sometimes silence is just strength gathering itself for the fight that's coming. Never assume that being old means being powerless. Sometimes age just means you've had more time to learn which battles are worth fighting. And never assume that quiet people don't have weapons. Sometimes the most devastating weapons are filed away in cedar trunks and manila envelopes, waiting for the right moment to remind the world that paper remembers what people try to forget. My daughter-in-law thought she could erase me with paperwork, but paperwork saved me instead. She underestimated a mother's determination and a widow's resolve and the power of love that reaches across death to protect what it built in life. Today, when I sit in this kitchen where prayers once rose with steam from soup pots, I don't feel erased anymore. I feel present. I feel rooted. I feel like the woman my husband married and the mother my son once loved before lawyers and greed taught him to forget family loyalty. If you're listening to this story, remember, your legacy matters, even when others try to steal it. Your voice matters, even when others try to silence it. Your place in this world matters, even when others try to erase you from it. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to disappear. Never assume silence means defeat. Sometimes silence is the space where strength gathers. Sometimes it's the pause before justice arrives. And sometimes it's the sound of truth being written, line by line, on the very papers they thought would destroy you. If this story touched your heart, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next inspiring tale of courage and justice. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone who needs hope today. Until next time, remember that quiet strength can move mountains, and sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply refusing to give up.